Hello, folks. Welcome to New Realities, New Horizons, Augmented and Virtual Reality in Libraries, Classrooms, and Development, a webinar brought to you by the Film and Media Roundtable and the Games and Gaming Roundtable of the American Library Association. I'm Thomas Vose. I'm the GameRT past president and the director at the Ruth Enlow Library of Garrett County out in Western Maryland. I'll be your host and moderator for this session. Now, this event is being recorded. The recording will be available for FMRT and GameRT members for 6 months for becoming publicly available on the FMRT and GameRT websites. So we're also live streaming on Twitch. So hello to everybody viewing there. Twitch video on demand will still be accessible after the 6-month members only period. Keep an eye on the chat because we will be sharing links to upcoming events as well as GameRT and FMRT websites and social spaces. There will be a Q&A session at the end of the presentation. And if you have questions during the presentation, please use the Q&A feature to submit questions, not the chat. Questions asked in chat, we can miss those, but our tech team will try to catch them if we see them there, no promises. So let's get on to the presentation. Our first presenter today is Jasmine Clark. She is the Digital Scholarship Librarian at Temple University. Her primary areas of research are accessibility and metadata in emerging technology centers. Currently, she is leading the Virtual Blockson, a project to recreate and gamify the Charles L. Blockson Afro-American Collection in virtual reality to teach high school students primary literacy skills. She is also doing research in 3D metadata and the development of Section 508 compliant guidelines for virtual reality experiences. She's also the chair of the DLF Digital Accessibility Working Group, as well as the co-chair of the DLF Committee for Equity and Inclusion. And we're going to go ahead and fire it off there. Jasmine, take it away.
Thank you so much. So then I'll go ahead and share that. Can everyone see these slides? Great. So today, of course, I'm going to talk about VR and digital scholarship at Temple University Library specifically, even more specifically my own work. So first things first, I work in a space called the Loretta C. Duckworth Scholar Studio. It is a multifunctional interdisciplinary space. And by that, I mean it consists of a makerspace, an innovation studio, high-powered computing for students who want to game or do photogrammetry or a number of other things, as well as a VR studio. Speaking of that VR studio, it currently exists. Actually, this is a slightly dated, but not that dated photo. It holds 10 people who can game at the same time. We regularly host larger classes there, so it's a pretty common space for that. There's an omnidirectional treadmill, which is that baby bouncer thing in the kind of top right corner. We have a number of different types of headsets, and there you'll see in this kind of bottom or the left of the photo, a projection screen with projection sound. So that's really useful for classes. When somebody is playing in the VR headset, everybody can watch what they're doing on that screen. Really popular with the K-12 crowd. If you've never seen a bunch of 13-year-olds watch their friend in a headset and like it becomes very collaborative, they'll be like, to your left, and physically turn their friend and be like, go, go. And it's like very fun to watch. So if the space is indeed soundproof, don't worry, we're not disturbing everyone. It's a very popular space. So my work with VR, particularly the work I'm going to talk about today, is going to be divided into 4 different kinds of projects. I'm going to talk about teaching SketchUp for art history. We'll get into how that ties to VR. Accessibility auditing, so the kind of accessibility for disability component of it all. The virtual Blockson, and the 3D metadata research with CS3DP, which is the community standards for 3D data preservation. I'll get into detail with more of this now. So I'm going to open up with SketchUp for teaching architecture. I partner with Emily Newmeyer, who is a professor in art history, and students are assigned a floor plan of a building. These 3D models are actually built by students in the class. So they come to the LCDSS, the Loretta C. Duckworth Scholar Studio, or just the DSS for short, for 2 SketchUp workshops that I lead and teach. The students then use that free cloud-hosted version of SketchUp to build these models based off of those floor plans. So these are actually buildings to scale. They don't always just build the buildings themselves. Somebody built the Taj Mahal, but they just recreated the gardens and layout because that's an extremely intricate part. Another student, there was a mosque on top of a hill, and while the mosque itself was nice, its selling point was that when you looked out the windows, it was in the center of a valley. So it could oversee the city and like beautiful landscapes. So what the student did is not pay as much attention to the internal, but recreated the feeling of being on a valley. And that is because at the end of the semester, they view those models that they created in SketchUp in VR in that space I showed you earlier. So they get to come in, put their classmates in the headset, and actually see their buildings in scale. So they get to have a look around, and that gives this additional like learning component for Islam. This is Islamic architecture in particular. And these models are really amazing. Some of the students go very hard, like very hard. And it is very impressive, as you can see. Accessibility auditing. We have conducted user testing. I began back in 2017, 2018. There's a lot more research on it now, but at the time there was very little. There had been one kind of self thing done by the Disability Visibility Project, where they basically asked people to just send them, disabled people to send them their feedback on the headset or the VR experiences they'd had. So we conducted user testing with deaf, hard of hearing, and different types of visual impaired users. I'm in the process of developing a user-friendly auditing workflow. So right now, auditing is traditionally reserved for developers, right? In order to create some documentation around accessibility failures and barriers, I'm trying to create something that is geared towards, in essence, student workers who would be able to play basically in the headsets and document accessibility barriers so that we could either provide that to developers or use it for service, so that we could say, if someone comes in, this game may or may not work with you, because that's the ultimate finding, is that everybody is so different that one experience that works for one type of visual impairment won't work for another. One type of disability won't work for another, and we can design interventions as we go. I am working with the university's central IT to talk about how we can make these freely available to the public so that other universities and schools can take them and just use those reports as they will, or even contribute to them as well. I did publish in the DLF toolkit. There's a DLF Teach 2.0 for immersive pedagogy. I published 3 things: an immersive technology auditing checklist, so things just to keep in mind. How to create an equally effective alternative action plan for immersive technologies. And that's basically just a set of documentation that says, if something fails, or this has failed, this is the accommodation we've planned, this is who's responsible for it, this is when we have to do it. And it builds accountability in, as well as creates a plan for individual students. And then some basic recommendations for accessible pedagogy with immersive technology. So talking about things like if your student has an IEP or other things, and it goes from structural to individualized, as well as like an overview of disability and accessibility. The virtual Blockson. The Blockson collection is based out of, this is this first quote: "Blockson's passion for history and books began at the age of 9, when a teacher asserted Negroes have no history." In 1980, this set him off on a lifetime of collecting. Starting at 9, he began collecting everything he could find to the related to the African diaspora and Black people in the continent. And in 1984, he donated his collections to Temple University, and today it consists of over 700,000 items on the global Black experience. Just as part of why this is particularly relevant, Philadelphia schools are 52% Black, 22% Latinx, and Latinx heavily Dominican and Puerto Rican, meaning still very heavily of African descent. 13% white, 7% Asian, and 5% multiracial other, with that multiracial still being very consistently heavily Black mixed. So what we're doing is we're creating a VR game that recreates the Blockson space and turns it almost into like a puzzle escape type game, where students are learning about Black history while also learning about how to conduct primary source research. And it will be in line with Common Core standards. We put in a grant already. We're working with a social studies professor who specializes. This is geared towards high school seniors. He does high school social studies. So that's that. And then 3D metadata and preservation. The community standards for 3D preservation. We're a radically inclusive interdisciplinary community of librarians, researchers, engineers, and designers who collaborate to develop better and more intuitive digital 3D data preservation practices. The book was recently published, and there's an open access version. I did 3D metadata, but there are chapters on 3D data preservation, management and storage, metadata, copyright and legal issues surrounding 3D data, and then accessing. So how do you publish it and get that out there? And I have the link in the slides to get the free version, the open access version. So some basic challenges and considerations in running this space and doing this work. If you're using established third-party software in VR as a service, so just getting things from Steam or other places, some things that you are going to have to consider is licensing is complicated for educational institutions. Establishing multiplayer accounts is also challenging because these are typically designed for individual users. They're not necessarily designed with like educational institutions or like larger institutions in mind. Accessibility for disabled users is still extremely undeveloped. So there's multiple people. There's a whole XR access community built working around this. It's just still in progress. Sanitation of equipment, particularly in our current environment, can be challenging if there's not heavy monitoring of the space. Some people keep sanitary wipes next to the headset so people can wipe them out between uses, but then you have to trust people to do so. We have student workers who go in regularly and do it, but that's not always between every single use, right? That doesn't stop people who are in the room at the same time from just passing the headset around to several people, like as if they're playing together. The cost and obsolescence of technology is a very real thing. The Oculus Go's went up $100 this year, was it 100, I believe? Not to mention headsets constantly just go out. They're not being supported anymore. Just things to consider. Programs expire, or if you're developing, that's a whole other thing. And age ratings for experiences can vary. So there's not always like an E for everyone for these experiences. So if you're working with younger kids, it can be kind of hard to navigate and find things that are age appropriate if you don't know if you're not familiar with it for getting started. Having a VR developer, if you're thinking about developing VR in and of itself is kind of hard. We lucked out. Our IT person also just is a VR developer in his own time, but that's not common for most libraries or schools, like school at all, to just have a developer on hand. And then preserving and managing VR, if you're an information professional, you're going to think about these things. Best practices are still very much in development. That book is kind of our way of all coming together and saying like, these are the requirements and challenges we're facing. It offers like a good, better, best model, but there's not necessarily, like the Smithsonian has a pretty advanced photogrammetry 3D data system, but systems that host and like successfully preserve these things are still very much in demand and in need. If you'd like to read my work or connect with me via my socials, that's my link tree. And that's everything I have today. I'm sorry if I ran over time.
Not at all, not at all. Thank you very, very much, Jasmine. That was awesome. And now we have our next presenter, Andrew Borman. He is the digital games curator at the Strong National Museum of Play in Rochester, New York, which must be an awesome place to live. The Strong holds the most comprehensive collection of material related to play in the world, from toys and dolls to video games and everything in between. In addition to building the museum's collection and designing exhibits, Andrew's exploring methods of preserving the electronic games collection, from the floppy disks of yesterday to the digital games of today. So take it away, Andrew. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So yeah, today we're talking about preservation and access in VR and AR technologies. A lot of this will be on VR, but a lot of it is also applicable to AR technologies as well. So just some quick background on the museum. If you've never visited before, please do. We're located in Rochester, New York, close to Niagara Falls. Our mission is all about exploring the ways in which play encourages learning, creativity, and discovery, and really how it's a big part of our culture today. But we are a collections-based museum. And what that means is we have over 550,000 objects and growing. And there are going to be many things that you recognize, or at least kind of recognize, throughout there. On the left-hand side, we have a prototype of Monopoly, probably one of the earliest Monopoly boards ever made, but we know that there's more history than just Monopoly. Action figures like Star Wars, arcade games like Pac-Man, and our newest big collection is our National Archives of Game Show history. So if you're into game shows, that collection is currently being built. If you participated in game shows, feel free to reach out. But this is a collection that we're really excited because this really bridges the gap between, it's almost a performance in a way that is similar in some ways to VR. In addition to all those collections, we also have a library here, actually multiple libraries, but our primary access library for behind the scenes has over 227 volumes, books, trade catalogs, academic journals, magazines, you name it. Published materials are in that part of our library, but we also have the archives of play. And that includes primary source documentation, which for video games includes things like game design documents, so you can learn how the early concepts were made. Source code, if you want to see how early games are made. I have this example of River Raid, an early Atari 2600 game. drawings, correspondence between developers. What was the culture like? All of that is really interesting. And we have many unique things that you will never see elsewhere, and you can come here and actually play them. We host over 100 researchers in person every year, but we're also open to some things virtually. But really why we're here today is why talk preservation? Quite honestly, most of you don't care about preservation. You want to run a library program or some sort of program, whether that's, something that's open every day, maybe it's a weekend event, whatever that may be. You're not really concerned about the long-term viability of those collections, and that's okay. But many of the issues that we're facing as a museum will be similar to the issues that you're going to face at your own institutions in providing access to those VR and AR technologies. So it's through this lens that we can explore what issues you may encounter along the way. So let's say you've decided to do AR or VR in your library. That's the first big step. Can be the hardest to get people to buy in, but you're here, you're ready to go. So one of the very first things you'll have to decide is what sort of hardware do you want to use? Your choice of hardware will impact the availability of software. Games and programs on one device may not be accessible on another. And cross-purchase, the idea that you purchase on one specific platform and get it on another, is really fairly rare in the VR world. I use this example because we are a collections-based museum of the CyberMax, which was an early 1990s VR headset. It probably supported 12 games, maybe 30. Very big, very bulky, nauseating in many ways. So I don't think this is one that you're going to choose. If you do choose it, I would love to hear about it. But I show you this just to show that VR is not a new concept, but it's also not a surefire success. Look at us here today. We're meeting on Zoom. We're not meeting in the metaverse. We're not meeting on VR chat. We're meeting on Zoom. So that alone should temper some expectations. In the middle, we have the Oculus Quest 2, made by Facebook, Meta. Who knows if they'll change their name in the future. Whatever their name is, that's not important. But you do have one big advantage with that. It's flexibility. It's all in one. You don't need a computer. You can use it with a computer. And really for most people, this is, you get everything you need with that. It comes with the controllers, it comes with a headset, everything that you need. But there's some downsides when you're thinking about long-term preservation and providing access to people at your institution. The first is a bit of a mixed bag. It does use AA batteries standard, which is a bit odd nowadays. That can make it a harder day-to-day, but long-term, it's a lot easier to replace AA batteries than lithium batteries. The controllers aren't the most robust things, so if you break them, $75 for a new one. The headset itself is rechargeable, but that comes with the downside too, because if that battery fails, well, now you don't have a way to replace it. And that's potentially a fire hazard. So think about things that you're storing long-term at your libraries. So we have a lot of batteries here, and it keeps me up at night sometimes. But it is otherwise wireless, no tripping, no ripping essential wires, and it has a lot of the basic parts available. The straps, the facial interfaces, those are all replaceable, but the device itself is not. And we're not just talking about the display. The Quest 2 being all in one, basically a mobile phone. If it stops working, that's the end of it. So your choice is to buy a new headset. And as Jasmine also noted, they just raised their price by $100. With the Valve Index, the headset on the right, you need a nicer computer, and it requires you to be tethered. And to be clear, there are many, many other choices of range, but this is probably one of the more expensive options. But the main benefit is if the main computer, the main brains dies, you can hook it up to another computer. And that's really, really convenient long-term. But it does require more setup. You have these base stations that track, but it provides a better experience when it works right. No battery in the headset, rechargeable batteries in the controller, which we talked about already. Great short-term, long-term, not so much. Some parts are replaceable, but it's also widely adopted. So you're more likely to find some parts than some of the other headsets that aren't the Quest 2 as well. But why spend so much in the first place? Will feature better graphics, more immersive, better frame rates, which is important because your guests are likely going to step up, play a quick VR experience and leave. You don't want them to be sick. Now onto quick software. User accounts, read the fine print. I started the slide really a couple of months ago when we decided that we were going to do this presentation. And the fact is that the terms change constantly. I gave up on changing the slide. As Jasmine noted, with any device, you're dealing with digital storefronts. You can't just go and buy a Super Mario VR cartridge. You are having to buy digital things. Getting tax exemption is difficult, and support for any of your titles is almost non-existent. Some accounts allow some sharing, many don't, meaning you may be breaking the terms of service by allowing multiple people to share the account. Something that the Meta Facebook has come out and said, no, that's not true. And yet some people got banned along the way. And you'll also likely need one account per device, regardless of what device you choose, which means buying multiple copies of games. There are some storefronts with wider access that don't require that. There's other licenses. But like I said, it can be really, really difficult to get access to some of those storefronts. So for us at the museum, generally speaking, if we want to have a multiplayer or a wider museum program, it starts to add up real quick. And even if you do everything right, it just takes one event to remove access to your entire setup. If somebody breaks the rules, if they're playing online and they say something they shouldn't have, if somebody just decides, you know what, that person I'm playing with was too good, I'm going to report them for cheating, your account could be banned. That's something you really need to think about in the type of experiences that you're providing to your guests. And did I mention that there's poor customer service? It can be really, really difficult to get your account back if something happens. You also run into issues where games are removed or they're updated so they no longer work on past devices. And there's lots and lots of issues that can come, being that you're dealing a lot with digital software. But let's go back to preservation for a second. I wish I had this great answer where, everything is going to be great. You're going to be able to play it for the lifetime of the device. Everything will be perfect. But the fact is that long-term viability is almost impossible to predict. Upper left-hand corner, we have ET games and other Atari games that were buried in a New Mexico landfill. We have a few of those here, so we have literal garbage on display here at the museum if you'd like to see it. But that's just showing that the video game market is extremely volatile. And it's not really clear where things will settle, especially with VR. And I personally think that VR is the biggest and best that it's ever been, but we're still seeing a developing market. As I said, we're not in the metaverse right now. People are pushing back against, the image that Mark Zuckerberg released just last week or so. They didn't think it was good enough. So it's not really clear where things will settle. Take it, and because I'm at a museum, where we're thinking about preservation on a huge time span, that would be one concern, but I can't even guarantee 5 years from now you'll be able to play everything. So that's a decision that you need to make sooner rather than later. Do you need a long-term program? Many of you, like I said, you aren't worried about preservation, but it's not like a book where if you just set it on the shelf and take care of it, it'll be fine. There is work that goes into it. And just for reference, there is this VR Pac-Man game. Pac-Man, one of the biggest games of all time in our World Video Game Hall of Fame. We don't really have a way of playing this virtual reality game that you could have seen at theme parks in the mid-90s. And we really haven't in a long time. This isn't a recent issue. If you could find someplace in the past 10 years to actually play this game, I would like that because I want to go preserve that. And as always, if you're dealing with even lesser devices, Google Cardboard, really great in classrooms. I remind you, many services get killed by Google. So I do want to touch on AR though, because AR, augmented reality, it has two big advantages over VR. Most people have a device that supports AR. They don't necessarily have that for VR, and it doesn't require strapping something to your face. For me, I don't care, but for most people, they don't want to do that. It's weird to do that. But then you start to get into the same questions. What devices are you going to support? I don't think the Nokia phone supports AR technology, but technically, you could do a phone game through an Nokia phone if the network is still supported. How long? What will you do when iOS completely removes access to thousands upon thousands of apps, which happened just a few years ago? What happens when Google Android gets updated? Where are you going to use it? Is this an internal program where you're doing AR within your library or institution? Or is this something outside where you're having people leave with phones or leaving with technology and you're trying to support them remotely? That starts to bring in a whole host of issues. Many things require GPS, which adds risk. There's security issues. But on the positive side, we found that our guests at the museum are more open to AR technology and using their phones post-COVID. But how long will that last? I'm not really sure. So to begin wrapping things up, I have some questions that I ask of all of you. How do you see yourself using these technologies? Do you see it being a library program where you host it on certain weekends, or do you see this being an open technology? Is this something that you're going to make available for people to check out? Our only real moderate success with VR was having a guest relations host provide short, powerful experiences. But AR, okay. We've already talked about some of the COVID concerns. Dropping things to your face may not be popular. They make face shields, but they're not great. Now, I've been extremely critical this past couple of minutes, but VR is some of my favorite video game experiences in the past, 10 or 15 years, even ignoring times where VR wasn't even a thing. I also have access to multiple forms of hardware, whether it's, Valve Index, Oculus Quest. I work at some place with that technology support. Jasmine mentioned, be friends with your IT. So with any technology, these are extremely powerful tools. You could take people on journeys that they could have never imagined that you'd experience. Right now, it looks like I'm sitting in our lab filled with technology, but maybe you want to go somewhere else. Maybe you want to stand at the top of a skyscraper. Maybe you want to pilot the Millennium Falcon. Or maybe you can go wherever else your imagination takes you. I don't know what the future for these technologies are, but I am happy that we can experience it. You aren't alone in facing all these challenges that we're talking about today. Lean on your friends, including everybody here on this panel, and make sure you have fun, because that's what it's all about. Thank you, everyone.
And thank you very much, Andrew. That was awesome. And now we have one more presenter today, Shawn Patrick Higgins. He's a Portland-based coding and media arts teacher at ORCA, Oregon's largest virtual school. He's worked with youth in creative technology for over 16 years and in the classroom teaching coding for 11 years, specializing in project-based curriculum that fuses digital design, animation, audio, social, and games as a creative pathway to student success. So take it away, Shawn. Appreciate it.
All right. Here, I'll try to get the share on. Can you hear me? Does it sound okay? All right. Yeah, so I think I'll try to weave some of the threads from the first two presentations, because I think they do. While I'm at a virtual school now, I just switched at the end of last year. For the last 10 years, I was at Park Rose Middle School, which is one of the most diverse in the state of Oregon. Our high schools, and you might think Oregon not so diverse, but our high school is the 13th most diverse in the country. So it's actually this pretty fantastic little area. And that's where my focus has been. And just for context for what my classroom looked like, it's a bit odd. So it's kind of a fusion of media arts and coding, programming, but just general creative technology. I'm kind of different from the first two presenters in that they really focused on, they're in an institution and they have these institutional things. Like I have no institutional VR support. It's just getting kids hyped, which is pretty much my main objective. Right. At middle school level, we're talking around like 10 to 12. So it's kind of getting that exposure, learning a little bit how to do some rad projects or how to interact. Just one thing to note in this slideshow, these are all live links to all the free apps that I use. And that is one thing. I've never had budget. So I have 40 students in a classroom. It's free web apps only. You can't really install things, except I did get my own PCs that were more powerful and brought in just two. So there's 40 regular low budget computers and 2 high quality PCs that I brought to bring into the classroom. And that's where most of kind of this VR adjacent stuff kind of goes through. And I just want to talk about my first VR experience, because I think I was 12 and Blockbuster, you could rent this thing. And I was really excited about this. I think this is 1995, 1996. I don't know if anyone else has used a Virtual Boy. And I was really, really hyped because of I had 2 first VR experiences, and I'll show that off in a second. I don't know if anyone will have had this experience, but the Virtual Boy was super disappointing. It hurt my brain. Like Mario Tennis is kind of fun, but I got an awful headache after about 15 minutes. And I was incredibly disappointed. Oh, whoops. One second. because this was actually my first experience. There had just been a show on Fox, it's called VR5, and they go in these crazy worlds and they can do all these things and be different people, and your identity can shift and change. And then I got the Virtual Boy and I was like, oh, this is gonna be amazing. And as a 12-year-old, it was it was a bit of a letdown. But that's as a middle school teacher, and that's coding, media arts, creative tech, what I really do is like kind of get people and students hyped. So I'm going to try to focus on the hype, maybe in contrast to Andrew's presentation. It's also, but for all the reasons that Ms. Clark also spoke to, currently the output experience of VR is generally not something you can support well in a classroom or library environment, not directly at least. So I think that we probably need to open up what we think of VR as, and maybe break that down. So I want to do two things, and let's talk about what we can do with low or no budget, and then also to get you hyped on some possibilities. And just to start off, now this could be for teachers or in a library, is where do you start to dabble? And Andrew started mentioning using a phone, right? Because the virtual reality experience isn't necessarily just a headset that you toss on, right? Now, 360 video has been around for almost 7 years on YouTube. It's been around for a while. This is from 2018. It's going a bit fast, but I was just scrolling around. I'm not actually changing that. It was just a 360 video that I was recording to my students that I posted up in Google Classroom when I was at the Scratch conference at MIT. I was just like, hey guys, I'm at the Scratch conference. I just wanted to show off. And I kind of gave them like a quick tour. Now, when we're back in the classroom, 2019, students could watch that on YouTube and move it around with the mouse, but they could also open it up on their cell phone and use that gyroscope control. Now, Andrew mentioned Daydream, or no, you mentioned Google Cardboard, right? But it's the same thing where ultimately, like, it's just using your cell phone, but it's a holder. Students can also just hold it in front of them and turn around and walk around in an environment as well. And, so it's the spectrum of your virtual or augmented experience, right? And like some people might think that this is expensive, but it's not. It's just this one where this video is recorded. It was a Android phone that had it. I think it was $20 for this. They had some deal or something, but they were trying to clear them out because they didn't sell well. But it was $20 for my first 3D VR camera, and I have probably about 200 interactive. Well. Yes, well, so someone mentioned that Daydream was killed. The headset itself still works perfectly fine for most functional. So as a teacher, when you're thinking, what is this experience for my students, the physical hardware still works fine. It does exactly what it's supposed to do for less than $15 or $20. The point is that these are not really expensive things. And for the 360 VR video, it's an easy and fun way to boost student or attendee experience. Also, their awareness of interactive media, because you can control with the mouse, but also your gyroscope or your movement, right? You can also buy extensions or kind of Bluetooth interaction devices as well. But I think that used Daydream or Google Cardboard can really better simulate that experience on the cheap. While it was technically killed in 2019, you can still buy it for cheap. Works great. I do, and I know other teachers who do right now too, right? As little as there's a Daydream headset used on $8 on eBay, right? And as far as holding students' phones, right, that's a realistic solution for a small thing, right? I mean, new on Amazon is $20. And these aren't right. These are phone holders. There are different levels of fancy phone holders, but your phone is really that starting gateway. And then I also want to, Jasmine talked about 3D and 3D design and viewing 3D. So there really is this kind of explicit connection between 3D design work and VR. And there's these strands that are connecting everything that are growing more and more and more each day. So I just wanted to mention three. For those who have the slideshow, these are all active links as well. So there's SketchUp, which I had used a long time ago, but I had stopped using after I got into Tinkercad. Jasmine, when we're in the Q&A, will probably be able to talk more about this because I haven't actually used it in probably 8 or 9 years. But I had started with that. But Tinkercad, when Tinkercad came up, I just started shifting to that since it seemed a bit easier to work with the students. Just recently, I was in the an Unreal Teacher Accelerator, and with Unreal, they are releasing a lot of free resources to teachers and game making and things. And there's this Twin Motion, which is, it's not, you don't use it to design 3D so much. It was an architectural program, but you create 3D environments using kind of drag and drop methods, which for creating VR environments is excellent. You could design something in SketchUp or a 3D model or in Blender and bring that in and then start to build, copy, paste, add lighting. So it's a really interesting way. The downside, especially for Blender and Twinmotion, is you have to download it. Just put that little downloading gift right underneath, and that you need your computer that's pretty buff. And that was, that can be a deal breaker for a lot of schools, especially my school. 8-year-old computers, with 2 to 4 gigs of RAM, if you're lucky, isn't going to be able to run Twinmotion. I was able to install it on my kind of mid-range $1,000 one that I purchased and brought in myself. But your mileage will vary, but these things exist and they're getting cheaper, and it's more possible to use them every single year, right? There's a GIF here. It's a goat tower. I was just playing around with some students, but you can use programmatic solutions to create 3D environments now. I think 3 years ago, with the release of Scratch 3, Tinkercad added coding with Scratchbox, so programmatic 3D generation. Twinmotion, you can do something similar with a few mods where they have all these pre-made assets, some of them really, really high quality and interactive like lights, but you can develop that programmatically. And this gets into, later conversations, maybe in the Q&A, we could talk about some of the VR and AI, which will, there's been so much conversation about DALL-E recently, but, we're 5 years out from that kind of existing in a VR space. First simplistic, and then as each year goes by, it gets more and more complicated. And just to mention, again, I'm not an expert on SketchUp, so it's been so many years. So Jasmine, you'll probably know a lot more. But Tinkercad are both web-based and free. Tinkercad is owned by Autodesk, and it's great. It's great for what it is, for getting students interested in 3D interaction. And some of the usability, right? If you have students viewing VR videos that you're just giving them as like fun social check-ins, like, hey, I just went to, this gaming convention, or I just went to this, and I posted up on Google Classroom, and it's just for like the kids to kind of keep up with their teacher. But they're still learning how to, the motion, right? The language of virtual reality, digital interaction. And that's true with SketchUp and Tinkercad as well. The other thing is, I talked about before, the strands being built, the threads being built. And it was Tinkercad not only has Scratchbox for programmatic coding, but it also has Minecraft mode. And you can export out and import into Minecraft. And more of these threads are existing between the media students love. Game companies and companies in general know this, right? Epic has said that they're going to be adding export features in Fortnite Creative, so kids can design 3D environments in Fortnite and then jump into VR. These are all things that are like right on the cusp, more and more. And so and they're free for students. And there's different models. And then also just want to talk about getting hyped about the possibilities. While Virtual Boy failed me and didn't live up to VR5 when I was 12, juggling in Half-Life Alyx is really beyond the next level, and it's what I dreamed of the Virtual Boy was going to be, right? And that kind of digit support. People are still using Half-Life. It is probably the premier VR experience that you can have. It's absolutely mind-blowing to juggle in Half-Life. But there's other things like, while Google does abandon things, so there's that graveyard Andrew is talking about. Tiltbrush was a Google project, and now it's open source and it's on GitHub. You can click right here to jump over to see Tiltbrush on GitHub. And it has digit support. That means you can carve with your fingers. If you're moving your fingers, you're carving in 3D, right? Also, something that I was surprised by, but honestly, the most stunning experience I've ever had in VR is not, Alex Half-Life is amazing, but Google Earth, especially with some of the extra mobility features. you can jump into you can go back to your street where you lived in 5th grade. And they have movement-based virtual reality exploration that you can zoom out from your street and go to a planet level. Zoom back in by holding and moving your fist, right? Like the world is at your literal fingertips. And that's something, you know, that's available now, and it's expensive, but in 5 years and 10 years, you know, we've progressed so far that the entire world could be at your fingertips since Virtual Boy, right? In 1995, and where will it be in another 15 years? It's really absolutely amazing. Yes, yeah, the nauseousness thing. I'm lucky. I got an index, so that higher frame rate definitely takes some of that away. But I think that's it. I'm ready to move on. I think that's all I got for you for trying to talk about possibilities. But yeah, I don't know. I'm utterly excited. I wish I could do more in the classroom. Those limitations are super real. But man, there's so much opportunity, and it's absolutely fascinating.
Well, there's a lot there, and there's a lot from all of you folks. We sure appreciate the presentations you've given, but we've got some questions here for y'all to answer, and whoever is interested can just jump on in. Let's see here. So we've got 2 questions in the Q&A. The first one is, I'm interested in a multiplayer program, but how does that work for a public library? And how do you make it shareable at a specific time frame held at our library? And this is something I've personally dealt with too. How do you do a good connected multiplayer experience?
I actually wanted to there are a couple of things I wanted to touch on, but in regards to this one, depending on your needs, like if you're talking about we only need this to run for like a couple of weeks, what I've heard of some people doing is just renting out game trucks, which bring all of that equipment to you. There usually is one in like every major city kind of, but they're not like uncommon. If you just Google game truck in your location, they pop up. For example, I'll drop the one for Austin. I saw while I was there in the chat. And that's a good, if you don't have the money or space to dedicate to developing like a VR station for multiple people, that's probably the best, you know, short-term investment for something like that. I'll stick to this question for now and open it up for, of course, either Andrew or Shawn if you want to offer up anything.
No, I mean, I think that's the sensible approach. Create a program that provides a quick, powerful VR experience in some way. So choice of that game will be important, but also one where the players can feel comfortable in that. You know, I recommend anytime you put on a VR headset for the first time, sit down and do it and not stand. When it comes to multiplayer, look at games that don't necessarily require external services, external servers. Anytime you're asking players to log into Facebook, log into something, if you can take care of that ahead of time, great. If you can run it without being connected to the internet, I find that in certain libraries, certain ports can end up blocked by IT, making multiplayer more difficult. So if you can run it all within the library versus having to go external, that will help you as well. Basically, you're looking for local area network access whenever possible. But otherwise, the games are great. I think choose a game that has a wide range of players being able to experience it, and you'll have a great program.
Great.
Yeah, at the classroom level, I haven't really, that's actually something like the multiplayer, it's more advanced. I would also encourage you, like, you don't have to do that. There's so many things that are local that can be interactive programs. The students make things and view things and experience external things and not necessarily together. It's great, but it's also like, man, the budgets are tough.
Really quickly, I just want to respond to the ASL comment in the chat. I don't know how many people are familiar, but IBM has developed an AI. I'm actually part of a grant out of UT Austin. Which Texas University? Forgive me, I've submitted a couple of grants where they're integrating this into a VR library, recreation of their library. So I'll drop the link for that, sorry y'all, into the chat. There's also NVIDIA released like a whole article talking about how the AI basically, it works as image recognition, and it gets into like syntax and how it's actually done. Just very simplistically, it's a good quick read. That's just a response to the ASL question.
Yeah, and
Great.
just to add quick, there are VR chat rooms set up where people communicate using sign language. Those exist. They're often called out. You get the same wild antics as you would in a speaking VR chat as well. But it's a great experience. We have a huge hard of hearing deaf community here in Rochester. So it's something that we're aware of and something we're constantly trying to strive for, because as Shawn was mentioning, in terms of finger tracking, everything, like the Valve Index will actually track all individual fingers as you move. And it's a really powerful thing to really make something more accessible than it would have been otherwise.
All right, I got another question here. So the most logical place to offer VR or AR access is likely at a studio or through our library technology unit. As a media librarian who offers access to only game consoles and video games, how can a media librarian offer a workshop on VR AR for the general public? A couple follow-ups too. So
yeah, I was gonna say, in terms of that, once again, it depends on. So the biggest thing I recommend for for like larger groups, if you're talking about offering that, is the tethered or monitor, like a tethered headset. Like I said, we have consistent success across age groups with having that monitor so that everybody can see what someone's doing. It's not that everybody can get a turn in the headset and also wipe between uses, but they can also be entertained during someone's turn. It also can avoid having to restart the entire game. Sometimes you pick up where someone else started. It really depends on age group, right? Also, I would recommend against game experiences and more just like passive whatever. And this gets into your second half of the film. I'll let Andrew or Shawn answer before I get to that. But there are more cinematic experiences that I would recommend, as opposed to a game where it's kind of complicated to coordinate with all of those people going in and out of the headsets.
And speaking of cinematic experiences, there was a follow-up to this. What is the intersection between film and VR AR?
I'll just quickly, because I have it. So the examples that I will give, there's a heavy intersection. Derek Ham, who's a professor at NC State, actually just I don't know if he got back, but he was at Cannes Film Festival for his second VR experience, which is focused on the Negro Baseball League. And I'll actually share two of his experiences, which are both very cinematic, which is the I Am a Man experience, once again in chat, which goes into the sanitation worker strike and the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., as well as his Negro Baseball League experience. Both very cinematic. That's why he was invited there. In essence, he's basically a filmmaker with 3D and VR. Yeah. And so there's a heavy intersection. And there's also a huge market for training. So if you're familiar with the embodied labs experiences that are basically like film like 360-degree videos in VR, basically. And they're proven successful for helping develop empathy in like care workers. So Embodied Labs focuses on things like Alzheimer's, end of life care, things like that. And those are extremely cinematic in nature, but it gives you a more, of course, immersive experience. I'll pass it on.
Yeah, and there's something to be said too. I talked a lot about video games, but in terms of the creation process, these are tools that are being used by gigantic multi-million-dollar productions. If you look at The Mandalorian, the Star Wars TV show, that pioneered the use of giant digital LCD screens. And what was powering that often was video game technology. There's the engine, Unreal Engine, and many others that you could use for that. But they were actually able to import assets directly into that and then modify things as they're going. And actually, there's a really great special on Industrial Light and Magic on Disney Plus right now. And one of the episodes touches on that right at the end, where they were actually using VR headsets to explore the virtual sets that they were creating. And that allowed them to create a living, breathing set without physically building things. And the same is going for productions like Avatar, which really pioneered the I'll say the new age of 3D technology in film. They are creating virtual sets, strapping on VR headsets, augmented reality, and viewing not green screen anymore, or blue screen, but the actual early, I'm not going to call them finalized models, but early boxed models of the sets and everything. So you're able to see the actual production process, how the human actors overlay with the actual digital assets as well. So there is something there about creation that even for guests who don't care about video games or chatting with other people, lots of people like to watch things, and that goes without some of these other experiences that Jasmine was sharing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think both in the first part of the question and the second part, the connection to film and video is really explicit in that, this is a nascent form of like communicating audio and visually, right? This is a different version of it, but it's the same, philosophical through point. Just to mention, my degree is originally in video, and where I worked before I was a teacher was Portland Community Media, which is the public access station here. But that's where a lot of the VR training in Portland now is. Here, I'll just link this. This is from 2019, and it's been ongoing. But it's just the immersive media, immersive film, interaction. The first time that I saw 360 video, I mentioned that in my presentation. But I really think the idea that a lot of people get stuck on this idea that virtual reality is a headset and is this very explicit thing. But when they're doing trainings for virtual reality, 90 to 95% of the workshops that are year-long workshops have nothing to do with the headset. That's for testing and experiencing, but the designing, the making, the philosophy, like none of that is VR. So I think that a lot of people kind of focus on the headset too much, while the experience and the knowledge, you have any phone can get the partial viewing of the experience, and you're adding senses and sensorial experience with more of the first time I ever experienced 360 video, it was a permanent 360 video for the Time-Based Arts Festival. And it was a 30-minute arts performance, and it was shot in 360 video with over 30 performers. And it had geolocational sound. So as you traveled around the room, you'd hear that sound, but it was a permanent installation. So it wasn't a screen, it was a circle room, right? Shot on a 360 camera. So there's many different ways of experiencing this, and it's not necessarily one thing. So I just kind of mentioned that to other people.
Yeah, and that also touches on something that we didn't talk about today, which is mixed reality. The idea that, it's more of an in-between of virtual reality, augmented reality, where you're merging, the real world and the virtual world, often with headsets, but it really, takes the form of more standard augmented reality in some ways, where you're able to add things to your world and see them in a way that's beyond what augmented reality does, without fully losing your sense of self that sometimes happens with virtual reality. It can be very jarring to take off the headset and then go back to the real world sometimes. So this mix can also be something that isn't really here yet. Microsoft has the HoloLens and some other products out there, but it's one to watch, as I think that will help bridge the gap and make everyone a lot more comfortable with the idea of blending virtual digital worlds and our real world.
So here's another question. I'm curious about Roblox and VR, and if anybody has used this.
I have not.
Roblox itself is a very tricky subject, but the idea of Roblox and what it can offer is actually really powerful. It's a game creation tool, a creation tool beyond just games, that does it in a way that's very easy to access. But there are also issues, all those user account issues, those terms of service issues, what they're doing in information. You have to be really careful doing any sort of programming with Roblox. But it's one that I think, especially if parents or guardians are monitoring it, specifically if they're kids, obviously, I think there's something there that can help bridge the gap between safer experiences and something that many kids, quite frankly, are playing anyway, whether we want them to or not. But just be careful.
All right, we're getting a little low on time here, so let's just do a couple quick more questions here. What is the best file format to export to from Blender and SketchUp to run in VR? A nuts and bolts question.
Yeah. The question is really what platform you're viewing them through. It's not really a file type. So that answers a few of the questions that are here already. when talking about like which accessories or licensing, it's not so much your hardware, not as much anything relatively recent. It's like, are you viewing through Steam? What kind of like, what platform are you going through? And others here might have like a preference. Flexing university money, we have so many headsets and different options that I'm like, it's all the same to us. It's not my money. Really quickly, I did put in the chat, Shawn brought up the Autodesk Autodesk option. They have a whole education community. So if you want free or low cost licensing, like I used Mudbox. I played around with Mudbox because I was trying to see if I could lead workshops on it, since I'll put the link in there again. So you can use pretty much any of their software for free with a free education license, and you just renew it as long as you have like an educational email for anybody who needs that. And then back to this, if anybody has actual software or hardware preferences.
Yeah, and with this software, you can typically output to whatever it is that you want to use, unless you're using some really odd technology. You know, there are plenty of guides out there that allow you to convert from one format to another. So one of the best parts about the VR community is that they're very open with a lot of things, even when the devices and the software user accounts aren't. So the communities are great. The knowledge base is out there. And it can really empower you to do a lot.
And then one more question here. We are also interested in potential development support. We run a health sciences campus VR studio, and we received a number of faculty requests for custom VR experiences, but we're concerned about cost, necessary capacity, and potential for failure. So what level of support do you currently provide, like spherical video? And how do you manage expectations? Where do you get your funding? And do you share your VR software with other institutions?
So I have a lot of thoughts on this. We actually do have we have a health sciences person who also is not hired as a developer, but who is can develop. And I also worked with Oklahoma, who for a while had their own VR developer as well. And I tell people it's not that different from if you have someone who builds websites, where you can't build a website for everyone who wants one, because not everyone has a fully fleshed out idea. They're just like, I just want a website for my research, and they could just use WordPress. It's not that serious. I think that beyond a developer, you need someone who's a good game development project manager. That's the role I largely play, is like knowing how long things are going to take, helping develop assets, like knowing what role, storyboarding, all of that. Having that knowledge is kind of your first step. Getting a developer to build things you need both. If you just have a developer, they can kind of work with you and say like, this is possible. But in terms of feasibility, or a good, I know some people hate this term, but like return on investment, in terms of it being worthwhile and like a worthy, that's somebody you need, like at least a relative, like anything. Like if you're building a digital asset management system or migrating into a new one, you need a good project manager, right? So I would say that's the first thing. In terms of managing expectations, that's going to come down to like the side. That's if you have someone with that knowledge, like I can listen to someone's idea and be like, that's a little too big for what we're doing, because it's not just building it, it's hosting it, it's supporting it later on, it's maintaining it. If Unity like makes an update and half the game breaks and you need to, or if they change headsets and you need to update it, there's a lot of work that goes into maintaining a game or development afterwards. So it's the constant problem of like, how do you get faculty to think about feasibility and project management? And you need someone who can do that. I hope that it doesn't seem like a throwaway or like avoiding the question, but.
That's very good. In fact, I would extend it to the others. How the heck do you get your folks to sign off on paying for all this?
I'm lucky in that I have a budget every year that lets me buy certain things, that is part of our mission to preserve the history of play. But yeah, I mean, setting expectations is key. You're not going to get tons of individual experiences that one person will experience, then you throw it out. That just doesn't make sense. It's not as easy as photocopying something, but you can take a lot of these programs, whether it's a Roblox, whether it's a VR app, and you can import different models. If the idea is just to see something, that alone is way more powerful than people expect. And this is something that Shawn talked about a lot with the cardboard. If all you want to do is see something, you can do that for such a budget level and relative ease. People will walk away impressed with whatever you do. So, yeah.
Yeah, and unfortunately, as a teacher, the answer is you don't. You know, like I got $300 a year for headphones, and I always run out in the last 2 months of school. And I spend my own money and bring my own stuff. You know, you can write grants, but it's like every year writing grants, trying to get computers that aren't, or like monitors that aren't busted, is like the reality of a lot of teachers out there, right? So it's you know, but that it's figuring out how to do it for free or how to do it for cheap, and realizing how to do that well, right? I love fidelity. I was like a film person, but you can create amazing experiences for your students and get them super hyped with very little money. There's so many free tools out there now, you know, and it's like you get one good computer and you can kind of bring a lot connected to that.
Well, that is the top of the hour, folks. We have filled an entire hour talking. We got still so many questions to answer. You guys did a wonderful job. We really appreciate all the support you've given, all the presentations, and all the knowledge that you've displayed here on the subject. And for those of you in the audience, if you're a member of the Film and Media Roundtable or the Games and Gaming Roundtable, great. If not, what the hell are you waiting for? Sign up. We'd love to have you. And thank you all very much. We're going to go ahead and end the recording now. And maybe we can stick around for a few minutes for those interested and answer a couple more questions. Would you folks be comfortable with that?
Thank you, everybody. Sounds great.
Thank you very much. So for those sticking around,